Over 100 million women are statistically missing. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
It's a pretty jarring thought, right? And it's the reality that economist Amartya Sen lays out.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be looking at today.
Okay.
The whole relationship between gender, globalization, and development.
Yeah.
And this is a big one for our UPSC aspirants, of course, especially those of you focusing on international relations. But really, this is a topic that impacts all of us in one way or another.
I mean, it's definitely something that's at the forefront of global discussions, right?
Totally. So to help us break it all down, we're turning to this text. It's considered like one of the leading texts on globalization and development. And it does a really great job of diving into the theories, the impacts, even some of the controversies that surround women's roles in this rapidly changing world.
I think for those who are preparing for the UPSC exams, this deep dive is almost like having a cheat sheet for understanding like global issues.
Yeah.
The source helps connect the dots between theory and what's actually happening in the world.
Right. And that's something that can really make your answers stand out in the exam. So let's jump right in, shall we? The source starts off by looking at the socialist feminist perspective, which, in a nutshell, argues that capitalism and patriarchy, they're kind of two sides of the same coin.
Right. The argument is that these two systems actually reinforce each other and kind of keep those gender inequalities in place.
Right. So one of the ideas they talk about is this concept of women being like a reserve army of labor.
Hmm.
Have you heard of that?
I have.
So what that means is women are basically pulled into the workforce, when they're needed, right? Like during a boom or during a war.
Right.
And then when they're not needed anymore, they get pushed back into those traditional domestic roles.
Yeah, it's almost like a cycle that just keeps repeating itself, right?
Right. It just serves those capitalist interests and often at the expense of women's well-being and economic independence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what often gets overlooked is, all the unpaid work that women do.
Right. Like at home.
Yeah, like all the childcare, housework, you name it, it's often invisible in those traditional economic models.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The source really highlights how essential this work is,
Yeah.
but it doesn't really get recognized or valued in the same way as paid work.
It really makes you wonder, if we only value work that gets paid for, aren't we essentially undervaluing a huge part of what women contribute to society?
That's such a good point. It's
Right.
a huge critique, and especially in the context of globalization.
Absolutely.
So speaking of globalization, let's talk about how it's reshaped the landscape of women's work, the whole feminization of work thing.
Right, right.
It's had some pretty interesting consequences.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, on the one hand, you have like global industrial restructuring, right?
Yeah.
Which has kind of shifted manufacturing to those developing countries. And that's led to more opportunities, more jobs for women, especially in Asia, Latin America, those sorts of places.
Right. But it's not always a positive story, right?
No, unfortunately not.
The source also talks about those pink-collar jobs, in those developed countries. So like retail, hospitality, administrative roles.
Yeah.
And these are often filled by women, but they also often come with lower wages, fewer benefits, sometimes even a lack of basic, like, labor rights.
Think about like garment factory workers in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Or domestic workers here in the U.S. These are all pretty much female-dominated sectors
Right.
where exploitation is a real concern.
Yeah.
So, it shows just how unevenly the benefits and the risks of globalization are spread out.
Yeah, it really is a reminder that globalization isn't some magic solution. Right? It can create opportunities, but it also creates vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And it kind of leads us to another dimension, which is what the source called the feminization of migration.
Right.
So more women in developed countries entered the workforce, right?
Yeah.
Which created this thing they're calling a care deficit.
Right. Like somebody still had to do all that care work, right?
But exactly, exactly. And oftentimes those roles are filled by women who are migrating from, developing nations.
Right. And they often have to leave their own families behind.
Yeah.
It's like a whole global care chain, driven by economic necessity and these global inequalities.
It's really quite something. I mean, think about it. You have a woman from the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
Who might migrate to Italy, say, to work as a caregiver, and then she's sending money back to her family.
Yeah.
It just really highlights, these complex forces at play. Economic forces, family structures, gender roles.
Right. It's all kind of reshaped by this process of globalization.
Absolutely.
It is fascinating.
Right.
But it's also, kind of heartbreaking in a way to see how women's lives all over the world are connected like this. And it also leads us to kind of a darker side of this whole feminization of labor.
Yeah, the sex industry.
Right.
It's something that the source definitely doesn't shy away from addressing.
Yeah.
The expansion of sex tourism and the horrific realities of human trafficking. The UN estimates something like 80%, a staggering 80% of trafficking victims are women and girls.
Wow.
And most of them are trafficked for, sexual exploitation.
Right. The source uses Thailand's sex industry as an example.
Hmm.
That economic boom back in the 70s led to a surge in demand for sex work. But at the same time, you have this poverty and these limited opportunities that are pushing women and girls into that industry.
And I think the important thing here is that globalization isn't creating these problems out of thin air.
Right.
What it's doing is it's magnifying those inequalities that already exist. So you have poverty, you have gender discrimination, limited access to education.
Right.
All of those things contribute to the vulnerability of women and girls.
And it makes them more susceptible to exploitation in this globalized world.
Exactly.
Yeah. So while globalization can definitely bring about some positive changes, it's not a
Not a cure-all.
it's not a magic bullet for gender equality.
Right. And that's where understanding different development perspectives becomes so important. The source dives into modernization theory,
Okay.
which basically argues that as countries develop economically, that paves the way for greater gender equality.
So the more industrialized and technologically advanced the country becomes, the more rights and opportunities women will have.
Yeah, that's the general idea, and kind of sees those more traditional societies as inherently patriarchal, right?
Right.
And believes that market-based capitalism can actually be a liberating force for women. So as women gain access to things like education, employment, political participation, the thinking is that those gender roles will start to even out a bit more.
That sounds kind of optimistic, but I'm
Right.
sure there's some critiques of that theory, right?
Oh, absolutely. Feminist scholars argue that these kind of development as growth models, they often miss the mark when it comes to the specific challenges that women face.
Right.
And sometimes they can even reinforce the inequalities that are already there. They point out that a lot of these models are built on masculine norms,
Yeah, okay.
and they don't really account for all of that, unpaid care work.
Right, that falls disproportionately on women.
Exactly.
So it's not as straightforward as saying, economic growth equals gender equality.
Definitely not. And Amartya Sen's idea of missing women, it really drives this point home.
Right.
I mean, the fact that in some areas of the world, women have higher mortality rates,
Yeah.
due to things like sex-selective abortion, infanticide, unequal access to health care, nutrition, all of that.
Yeah.
It suggests that, development doesn't always automatically translate into better well-being for women.
Right. It's a reminder that we really need to look beyond just those economic numbers
Yeah.
and really consider those social and cultural factors that shape women's lives.
Yeah.
So before we move on from this, I want to touch on one development approach that specifically targets women, and that's microcredit.
Right, right. The source highlights that the Grameen Bank, I believe, in Bangladesh, which was a pioneer in microcredit initiatives, specifically to empower women economically.
So providing these small loans, usually to groups of women, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To help them start their own businesses or invest in their families' well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've heard about microcredit. It sounds like a pretty promising approach, but are there downsides?
Well, there's always critiques, right?
Sure.
Some folks argue that microcredit can actually lead to this cycle of debt dependency if those loans aren't, carefully managed.
Yeah.
And others point out that while microcredit can be a good boost in the short term, it doesn't really get to the root of the problem,
Right.
which is that underlying poverty and inequality.
So it's a tool, but it's not a solution in and of itself.
Yeah, exactly.
We have to be mindful of both the benefits and the limitations. This is all incredibly insightful, especially for those of you prepping for those UPSC exams. understanding these nuances and how global forces interact and the different perspectives on gender and development, it's all key to acing those exams. But even if you're not taking the UPSC, this is just good knowledge to have, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is for anyone who wants to, be part of an informed conversation about, what's happening in the world.
We'll be back in a moment to continue this deep dive, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to our deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about how the source material uses Thailand's sex industry as that example of how globalization can sometimes make those existing inequalities even worse.
Right. It's a tough example, but it really drives home the point that economic growth doesn't always mean that things are getting better for everybody.
Right. Right.
We have to remember that globalization doesn't just appear out of nowhere and change everything. It works within the systems that are already in place, the social structures, the cultural norms, even the power dynamics.
So in Thailand's case, things like poverty, limited educational opportunities for girls, even societal attitudes towards women, that all played a role in making those populations more vulnerable.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's a really important point, especially for those UPSC exams. Understanding those nuances, the interplay of the global and the local, that's key to giving those really well-informed answers.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a minute and talk about solutions. If globalization has both positive and negative impacts on women, what can we do to make sure that those benefits outweigh the risks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's not one simple answer, unfortunately. But the source does bring up some interesting ideas. For one thing, it talks about the importance of recognizing and valuing, women's unpaid labor.
Oh, right, right. All that care work.
Exactly, exactly. The childcare, the housework, all that stuff that often just goes unnoticed and uncompensated. If that kind of work was actually acknowledged and supported like it should be, it would go such a long way towards making things more equal between men and women.
Yeah, I mean, if those responsibilities were shared more fairly, it would free up women to do so much more.
Exactly. They could pursue an education, participate in the workforce, have more control over their own lives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what else can we do?
Well, we have to address that persistent gender pay gap.
Right.
And we need to make sure that women have the same access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities as men.
Okay.
And this is a big one. We have to stop, all forms of gender-based violence, things like trafficking and exploitation.
Those are some huge, huge challenges. I mean, where do we even start with all of that?
It's going to take a multifaceted approach, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We need those strong legal frameworks that protect women's rights.
Yeah.
We need investments in things like education and healthcare, economic policies that actually promote gender equality. But beyond all of that, I think we need a real change in attitudes, like a fundamental shift in social norms.
So it's not just about changing laws and policies. It's about changing how we think.
Exactly. Exactly. We have to challenge those old, stereotypical gender roles that have been around for so long.
This reminds me of something the source brought up about post-colonial feminist critiques. They argue that it's not accurate. And it can even be harmful to just portray women in developing countries as, victims.
That's such a crucial point. Women aren't just passively waiting to be saved by development.
Right.
They're out there making change happen.
Right.
They're resilient, they're contributing, and recognizing that is so important for achieving, real sustainable development that's fair for everyone.
It's about giving women the power to make decisions, to be leaders in their own communities and, all over the world.
Absolutely. And, this brings us right back to that missing women concept. If we can tackle the root causes of these gender disparities, everything from unequal access to healthcare to those discriminatory social norms, then, we can actually create a world where all women have a chance to really thrive.
Okay, so we've looked at the challenges, we've talked about the complexities, and we've touched on some potential solutions.
Yeah.
But I'm still kind of left wondering, what can individuals do? What can one person do to actually make a difference here? Because it can feel a little overwhelming.
It's a good question, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, but I think the important thing is to remember that change really does start with each of us. We can all make choices in our everyday lives that support gender equality.
Like what? Give us some examples, something concrete.
Well, for one thing, we can all call out sexist language and stereotypes when we hear them. We can support businesses and organizations that, are really putting women's empowerment front and center. And we can educate ourselves and others about these issues.
So it's about awareness, it's about speaking up, And it's about making those conscious choices.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about recognizing that, gender equality, it's not just a women's issue.
Right.
This is a human rights issue that affects us all.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation, and I know our listeners, especially our UPSC folks, are walking away with a much deeper understanding of this whole, gender globalization and development thing. We'll be right back to wrap things up and leave you with some final takeaways, so stick around. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about this, this whole intricate connection between gender, globalization, and development. And I've got to say, this is essential stuff for all you UPSC aspirants listening. We've covered a lot of ground here. I mean, from those big theoretical ideas to the actual impacts we're seeing in the world to some possible ways forward.
Yeah, and remember, the UPSC isn't just about like spitting back facts and figures, It's
Oh,
about critical thinking, it's about analysis, and it's about making connections between different ideas. And
exactly.
that's what we're hoping this deep dive will help you do, not just for the exam, but really, going forward.
Exactly. Exactly. So let's try to boil it all down to some key takeaways. Like, what are those big aha moments from this deep dive, the stuff that'll stick with you?
Well, one of the most important things, I think, is remembering that gender inequality isn't just, some isolated problem. It's built into our economic systems, those global power structures. We've seen how globalization can make those inequalities worse, but it also has the potential to make things better. That's where, that critical analysis comes in.
Right. And we also talked about how important it is to see women as actors in this whole process, not just as victims of these global forces,
Yeah.
They're shaping globalization and being shaped by it. And we have to understand both sides of that coin.
Absolutely. Think about all those women leading microcredit initiatives, those female entrepreneurs, the ones driving economic growth, the activists who are fighting for women's rights globally. Their stories are so important for understanding the full picture.
Another another big takeaway is that there's no one easy solution.
Right.
It's going to take like a multi-pronged approach. You have to tackle those deep-rooted systemic issues and those like deeply ingrained social norms that are keeping this inequality going.
It's like a combination of, legal reforms, economic policies that are actually designed to promote equality, investments in things like education and healthcare,
Yeah.
and of course, like we talked about before, that shift in how we think about gender roles.
Right. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with this one thought. We've seen how globalization can open doors for women, but also how it can create those conditions where they're more likely to be exploited. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What can we do as individuals and together to really make sure that things move towards real empowerment and sustainable development for all women?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's going to take a lot of conversation, a lot of critical thinking, and a real commitment to taking action.
Yeah, and for you, our UPSC listeners, this is just the starting point. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and use what you're learning to make a difference.
Absolutely.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with, your fellow UPSC warriors. And really anyone who wants to understand what's going on in this complex world of ours. We'll be back next time to dive into another topic, something else that'll help you with those exams and, help you navigate all of this.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep on diving deep.